So I'm happy to welcome you today to this event at the Middle East Institute, which is co-hosted by our cyber program and our program on Palestine and Palestinian-Israeli affairs. So today we're going to be talking about the issue of social media censorship and differential treatment of Palestine and Palestinian narratives online and what implications this has, particularly in the events of the last few weeks. So journalists and digital rights activists have long drawn attention to the issue of unequal access and experience of Palestinians and Palestinian narratives on social media platforms, with repeated reports of unjustified takedowns, account suspensions, and censorship of certain types of content online being regularly reported, not just over the past few weeks, but over the past 10 or more years as well. In the midst of a new wave of violence and conflict in Gaza and the occupied territories this past month, the topic of free speech online and the role of social media companies in mediating the Israel-Palestine relationship and in publicizing and giving access to narratives around the conflict has begun to raise increasing international attention. Just days after protests over forced evictions and escalation of violence against Palestinian residents of the East Jerusalem neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah, Facebook and Twitter admitted to wrongly blocking or restricting millions of mostly pro-Palestinian posts and accounts related to the crisis, mostly, for the most part, citing technical error, although some have said that this is not credible. As violence escalated into military strikes, this raised the question of whether the world's most popular and powerful social media platforms are mediating access to speech and allowing the world to watch this conflict unfold through the eyes of those who actually experience the violence. Users have reported takedowns, blocking of posting and content activity, deactivation of accounts on platforms including YouTube, WhatsApp, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, mobile payment accounts, and others, with Twitter actually mistakenly identifying posts tagged with the name of Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem and misidentifying it as affiliated with a terrorist organization rather than being one of the holiest sites in Islam. So this is certainly a problem that has very problematic and deep roots, and something that I hope we can try to understand better. Luckily, we are joined by three excellent panelists to help us think through this incredibly complex and important topic, and I'm really honored to welcome them today with us. Ignacio Delgado Culebras is the Middle East correspondent with the Committee to Protect Journalists and has worked as a freelance journalist throughout the Middle East, writing on civil society, democratization, and human rights issues. Marwa Fatafta is the Middle East policy manager at Access Now and leads the organization's work on digital rights in the Middle East and North Africa. She's also an advisory board member of the Palestinian digital rights organization Hamle, and a policy analyst at Al-Shabaka, the Palestinian Policy Network, working on issues of political leadership, governance, and accountability. And Aisha Jitan is the Digital Communications Associate at the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights, and she's also worked with the National Institutes of Health, the Middle East Institute, and Princeton University Press, and I'm very excited to have you all join us. So before we kind of get started with our deeper question, I kind of want to go to each of you. You know, there's been a lot of conversation around this topic in the past few weeks. And now that we're sort of a little bit removed from kind of the most intense reporting on this, just to kind of hear your reflections on this issue of digital censorship, which again has been something that has been reported on for years and years and has only kind of gotten widespread international attention recently and is continuing. So I want each of you to maybe comment on how you've seen the problem unfold, where you've been the most troubled and where you've seen the room for most improvement, and sort of where you think we should be watching next. So Marwa, let's start with you.
Thank you so much, Eliza and the MAI for organizing this timely discussion. I think what we witnessed unfolding the past few weeks is a culmination of everything that is wrong with social media and the way they moderate content related to Palestine, but also related to the wider MENA region. You know, as civil society organization working on digital rights, we've been, flagging to those companies the problems that we see again and again of censoring content of journalists and activists who are reporting on the ground and documenting human rights violations, relying on social media platforms. We've covered a huge volume of content being restricted and removed. And the problem again is the usual excuse used by social media platforms that those are a result of a technical error. And I think at this point, where indeed systems are bound to err, every system is prone to error and all sorts of glitches. We think that social media companies have the resources, have the data, have the systems, have the power to really understand and investigate internally what exactly has gone wrong during the past 2 weeks, but also to ensure that in the midst of this political violence and in the midst of this huge human rights crisis, what have you done to ensure that your users' right to freedom of expression has been protected? What we've seen is exactly the opposite. And I think by now this excuse of technical error is just as I said, is a convenient excuse to absolve themselves from that responsibility. And as I said, that those issues are not new. It's just an exacerbation of already existing problems, whether it be at the level of the policies that those platforms develop and deploy to moderate content related to Palestine, Israel, or the way they enforce those policies by using automation and artificial intelligence and machine learning that is absolutely blind to context to moderate that content. So however you look at the issue, there are profound problems from a human rights perspective that needs to be addressed and by those companies. And and I'm look forward today to discuss this further and what can be done to overcome this issue.
Thank you so much. Ignacio, let's go to you. Just tell us a little bit about your thoughts, kind of starting off on this critical problem.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Eliza, for organizing this. And for the most part, I agree with what Marwa was saying. Like, this is not new. We have been witnessing this like for many years. And it's not only the censorship that we see on social media or online. It's like this combination and coexistence of physical violence against journalists and digital censorship that leads to a clear shrinking of the space that Palestinian journalists, human rights activists, and civil society organizations have to operate in Palestine. So this is, I think, what we have witnessed over the past weeks. Like, I think yesterday, the Palestinian rights group Sada Social released a statement saying that they have documented 770 incidents of content removal, shutdowns of account, and I don't think like everything can be blamed on technical errors. We see in general also like a lack of understanding of the context in Palestine. Like you mentioned at the beginning, Eliza, like this, just to mistake one of the holiest places of Islam, like the Al-Aqsa Mosque, with I don't know, like a digital media affiliated with Hamas. I think like like this is a blatant lack of understanding of how things work in Palestine, and I think like this is something that needs to be addressed. But like for the most part, at the Committee to Protect Journalists, like we are concerned about this combination. Like we have seen on the one hand the destruction of media infrastructure in the Gaza Strip, where like several buildings were bombed and they were housing like at least 18 media outlets. We have seen the violence against journalists who were covering the protest in the West Bank and mostly in Jerusalem, especially. And to top it all, like we have like all this censorship, removal of content that it's related to the protest, it's related to what's going on in Sheikh Jarrah. So all this leads to restriction and a crackdown pretty much on the freedom of expression, press freedom that the Palestinian journalists enjoy.
Yeah, thank you. And I think I'm looking forward to speaking a little bit more with you specifically on how this intersects with the field of journalism in the Middle East in the past few years as well. Aisha, happy to have your face join us. Could you just maybe talk a little bit about your view of this issue and how you've seen it play out?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for putting this together, and thank you, Marwa, and Ignacio for your very profound comments. I think what I'll add here is that what we've been seeing in these past couple of weeks and years, although this is really picking up in the past couple of weeks, is I think like a pattern of like routine and systematic repression of social justice movements. So I think it's important to couch what's happening in this context of like a historical lineage of deliberate political repression of social justice movements, so that the Palestine incident is not just exceptional, that this has been happening throughout history, and that it's going to continue to happen, and that we can expect it to happen. So from this, I think going forward, what we can think about is how can social media and other platforms be used as a tool for our collective liberation and to spread out the truth and to uplift the voices of marginalized people, while also navigating social media as a space that can be hostile towards our fights towards justice, and how we can kind of reclaim power and shift narratives within this kind of hostile environment. Really grateful to be here and excited for this conversation.
Thank you so much. So it occurs to me, just as you're all speaking, that something that I haven't really seen talked about as much in these conversations is sort of what's missing or what's at stake here. If content is removed, if Palestinian voices are sort of restricted in their access to these platforms. And again, if self-censorship integrates itself with outright censorship, which it often does. And for those of us who are of a certain generation, it's kind of hard to imagine not getting all your news from social media or from being online all day. But I've definitely talked to some experts who are sort of maybe not understanding fully why this is such a critical issue, just maybe because they don't understand how central and how much of a central lifeline social media is for Palestinians and for many people who live in places where freedom of the press or where access to information is not maybe as equal as it needs to be. So Marwa, maybe starting with you and Aisha and Ignacio, if you two want to kick in as well. Why does this matter so much exactly? Maybe to help our audience understand, what's at stake here?
I think that's an excellent question, because we often talk about freedom of expression and, having access to social media and speaking up freely without understanding what is exactly at stake here. And maybe I'll start by saying that this whole campaign of Save Sheikh Jarrah was based on the idea that those individuals, the families of Sheikh Jarrah, were facing imminent forced eviction from their homes, and what basically helped them to postpone the court order, for example, and stay where they are, is the support of social media. And I don't want to, overstate the role of social media. I don't want to say that it's because of social media that people have stayed in their homes. That would be an overstatement. But a lot can happen in the dark. And that's where the power of the press comes, where the power of social media, when you expose the violence on the ground, when you expose the police brutality, when you're able to narrate your own story with your own words, unfettered and uncensored, that's extremely important for political campaigns and movements, and especially for communities like the Palestinian people and Palestinian communities living under occupation, who on the one hand don't have access to traditional media and have been actually often dehumanized in international media. If you look at how a press coverage covered the event over the past 2 weeks, you'll see always this, either the equation between the occupier and the occupied, this fallacy of both sides, the kind of cut and coverage of certain events without contextualizing violence and understanding what is it exactly that the Palestinian protesters want. And social media gave people that platform, and it's not unique to the Palestinians, it's to all social justice and political movements around the world who don't have access to those traditional platforms. It's really important to get your voice out, to get your story out, to garner international solidarity, to build bridges between different movements like the Palestinian Liberation Movement and the Black Lives Matter, for example, in the US. That is enabled by having free and open access to the internet and to be able to use social media freely and safely. And I want to add also another dimension here. given the name of the webinar, and to really like give a concrete understanding and meaning of what do we mean by digital occupation. And in that sense, it's important to remember that Palestinians don't have access to an independent ICT infrastructure, even though they have the right to. But every piece of equipment, every piece of technology has to be approved by Israel before it's imported, has to be approved before it's installed. And that explains, for example, why Palestinians have been denied access to 3G when the world has already made it to 4G, and now the world has made it to 5G, and people are still running on those old technologies, among other things. They're heavily surveilled populations by the Israeli forces. And I guess the fact that, you know, Palestinians in the occupied territories live under military rule, they don't have access to, I mean, they are denied their political and civil and fundamental rights, including the right to freedom of expression and the right to privacy. And so within that kind of extremely constrained space, and the power asymmetry and the lack of access to independent ICT infrastructure, and relying heavily on Israeli internet service providers, and so on and so forth, I think the fact that you have few platforms, social media platforms available for Palestinians, whether activists, journalists, or just ordinary Palestinians, is extremely important within this wider context. I guess it's actually the only available tool for those communities to express themselves and to convey their realities as they see it. And it's really unfortunate to see that this power asymmetry and the repression we see offline being exported to the online world, with social media companies either interpreting the word of Palestinians at their behest, or maybe under pressure from the Israeli government, scrutinizing certain words like resistance or shaheed, which means martyr in Arabic, or banning individuals or organizations that Facebook considers to be terrorists or dangerous. The list is really long, and we see again that kind of translation of offline repression into an online, and this is where the danger is, because it means that the only space available to you as a political activist is also conditioned, and those private tech companies are able to sanitize your speech and force their own understanding of what should be and shouldn't be in terms of narratives available on those platforms. And that direction is dangerous, I think, not only for in the context of Palestine, but beyond that. As Aisha mentioned, you know, I think it's important to remember that this is not unique to Palestinians. We've seen it in many different contexts in the region, in Syria, in Egypt, and beyond that. And it's bad news for social justice. It's bad news for political campaigning when those private companies basically unilaterally deciding on their own what's permissible and what is not on social media or on those platforms.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, you know, going back to that question of sort of how this sets a precedent for other communities in the Middle East and even beyond outside the region. I want to go to Ignacio and just talk a little bit more about, you know, Marwa has covered really well how social media has basically become one of the main spaces for Palestinian civil society and for mediating, you know, what we used to maybe call here in DC, like the Arab street, I guess, for lack of a better term, for thinking about kind of public conversations and sort of popular understanding. How has that same shift to social media, kind of mediating most of people's work online, affected communities of journalists and the field of journalism in the Middle East specifically? It's especially the case that, you know, the line between someone being a regular citizen just filming on their phone, being a journalist, and being an activist is more porous than ever. And I think we may be finally ready to admit that boundary really doesn't exist in some cases. So what does this mean when we actually need to get good reporting, good citizen reporting, especially out of a region that is so heavily contested and where narratives are so heavily politicized? So yeah, what does this mean for journalism more broadly?
Yeah, this is a great question, Eliza. Like what we have seen, like in Palestine, we have like a very highly politicized traditional media outlets. So they are very affiliated with either one party, with Fatah or with Hamas or with other players. So social media, internet opened the field for many other players and for many other journalists. So we started seeing that Palestinians are relying more on digital media to get the news, like be it online. Like we have seen like projects like the Quds News Network, where they are like posting videos that are sent by private individuals who are documenting like what's going on their cities or their neighborhoods, like raids by Israeli security forces on certain neighborhoods. So I think like this type of censorship that we are witnessing now in the digital space is also limiting Palestinians' access to the news. In the context of Gaza, like over the past 2 weeks, like we saw like a pretty much like the perfect storm of how to create a media blackout. On the one hand, we see the destruction of media infrastructure, like we see all these takedowns and removal of content. And sorry. At the same time, like we are seeing how foreign journalists were denied entry into the Gaza Strip. So what's left for Palestinians to tell the world what's going on? So they rely on internet when they can, but again, like they face time and again these restrictions. And as Marwa was putting it, it's foreign companies, internet companies deciding what's publishable and what's not, what's news and what's not. And this is very concerning. That means that press freedom and freedom of expression is extremely limited by for Palestinians in general. Like we have also seen like how Palestinian authorities themselves like try to pass a cybercrime law. We have seen the blocking of websites. So in the end, like this is what's available to them, and I feel like they are entitled to the right to have their own narrative and to explain like how they see things without like any other interference. And I also wanted to highlight like one concerning development. Like this was recent, and this was like even before like the events in Sheikh Jarrah and the protests and the Gaza Strip. A couple of months ago, like the Israeli Supreme Court rejected an appeal by the Palestinian rights group Adalah. They were saying that Israel's Internet Referral Unit was violating constitutional guarantees on press freedom and freedom of expression. Basically, this unit, which operates under the remit of the Attorney General Office, like they refer Palestinian content and request removals by social media platforms based on their community standards or the internal regulations. So what we are seeing here and the concerning development here is that we are circumventing laws and this like letting social media platforms decide whether something is legal, whether something is entitled to be online or not. And I think this is like very, very concerning, especially because they are not required to inform the journalists of the reasons for the removal or who is behind like this request for removal. So yeah, I think there's right now a lot of dangers and a lot of threats facing Palestinians, press freedom and freedom of expression in general.
Certainly, and definitely the rise of, something like the Facebook Oversight Board, which they've kind of informally dubbed the Facebook Supreme Court. At least it gives a little bit of concrete evidence to this idea that Facebook effectively has the power to act as a government to decide what's legal and illegal, but it doesn't particularly portend any sense of optimism right now, for me at least, in terms of accountability and maybe not, we didn't necessarily elect any of those members to make those decisions for us. So I think it raises further questions about how the arbitration of such speech will be carried on in terms of the legal question. So Aisha, I want to go to you just in terms of thinking about the broader kind of campaign for Palestinian rights in the US campaign that you work on, for example. Something that's been really heartening for me just over the past month as we've seen, this wave of brutal repression is that I think there has been, to some extent, and I'd love to hear all of your thoughts on this, a little bit of a pushing open of the narrative on, what is justified in terms of struggle on the part of Palestinians, and how and why an understanding of the unequal dynamic of power is so important for people to understand when they make kind of conclusions about what is just or what is not just. And for example, even just personally, it's been really interesting and exciting for me to have, my 15, 16-year-old cousins and second cousins who live in like rural Utah message me and be like, what's going on with Palestine? Like, I keep seeing this stuff on TikTok and I want to understand it better. And I think it speaks a little bit to how the power of narratives online can really shape how people, learn about the issue of unequal power in Palestine, and how they start to push back or to learn a little bit more on their own from more types of outlets, and to get a little bit more of an informed sense of the situation on the ground. So Aisha, just thinking about, USCPR's work and sort of what you see and what you see with that organization as kind of the next phase of the work. How do you think equal access to social media or unequal access to social media will affect that, and especially when it comes to the power of narratives?
Absolutely, thank you. That's a great question. So first I'll speak to this idea of this new political opening that you mentioned, as the Palestinian issue is picking up traffic in social media, in the mainstream, and as people are like increasingly gaining the confidence and strength to say like, this is apartheid, this is systematic oppression, and to name the injustice that is going on in Palestine and how that's really spreading fairly rapidly. I will say that we need to really honor and attribute that strength and what we're seeing now to generations of work on the ground from the grassroots level. That people for years have been fighting to really like make Palestine an easy issue to talk about. One, and by easy I mean like no political consequences, and to really fight this repression that we're seeing. And two, to also make connections between the Palestinian issue and what we see happening in the US with Indigenous rights being systematically stripped away, with the attack on Black life, and so on and so forth. There are so many justice struggles that are really connected here. And I think the next phase in that work is to really continue powering the grassroots, because that is where power is. It's with the people, and we are the ones who are going to keep each other safe and to hold systems accountable when they aren't being held accountable. And a big part of that, like this idea of keeping each other safe when there is an issue of unequal access to social media and to having a voice in the digital world in this day and age for Palestinians, is to start organizing within the tech sector, right? To really think about like, how is systematic racism showing up in technology, and what can we do to really like stop that in its tracks, and to allow people to have the voices that they need, and to get their messages across in a timely and efficient way, right? And also building off of that, I don't think it's a coincidence that the movement for Palestine, right, in the US is picking up now, just like a year after the BLM uprising. This is all connected. I think people are slowly raising their consciousness of these issues and seeing how technology and social media can be used as a tool to hold systems accountable when our communities are being systematically hurt or silenced. So that would be my answer to that question.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's really critical. So Marwa, kind of turning to more of kind of the policy nitty-gritty of this issue. Something that's been covered pretty broadly is kind of a strain of a little bit of linguistic discrimination, or kind of the intersection of, these algorithmic systems on the part of the platforms, as you mentioned, kind of flagging certain words like shaheed and things like this. And then kind of maybe the lack of training or the lack of investment on the part of the companies in certain language areas to make sure that there's really nuance around what they're taking down. They're not just flagging a certain term and taking it down when it means something completely different. How have you seen this kind of linguistic element of the censorship issue change over the past couple of years? And do you see any room on the part of the companies themselves to maybe start investing in certain research or employee areas or different resources that might kind of improve the current situation?
Yeah, I mean, there are a number of issues here. One is the policies themselves and the way tech companies interpret Arabic language and the use of speech by local activists and grassroots movements. That's one. Two, the way they enforce those policies. And three, the lack of transparency in all of those operations. So if you look at, for example, or actually before going into examples, so when tech companies, Facebook, for example, said in the past few weeks, sorry, considering Al-Aqsa to be a terrorist organization when it's the third most holy site for Muslims was just a technical glitch, or the restriction of the hashtags and the timing of those glitches. I think they assume we don't know that those glitches and the systems that they put in place don't exist in a vacuum. They are engineered, they're designed to take on certain responsibilities. Now, when we look at the number of policies that Facebook has been implementing for the past few years, some of them are extremely problematic. One is the so-called Zionist policy, which falls under their hate speech policy. We have been consulted on that particular policy where, according to Facebook, the interpretation of the word Zionism, it can be, certain content can be interpreted as hate speech when Zionist is used as a proxy for Jewish or Israeli. And as has been recently covered by an article in The Intercept, according to the content moderators who have been given instructions to implement that policy, they said it makes very little room for criticizing the Israeli government or the Zionist narrative at large. The so-called Shaheed policy, another policy which falls under their dangerous individuals and organizations, that policy in itself, the mother policy, let's say, like the dangerous individuals and organizations, which according to Facebook bans the certain organizations or individuals that are terrorist organizations, according to the US, for example, the US State Department's foreign terrorist organizations list, or the US Treasury and others. That list is not public. So we don't know, or maybe we do know, who is right now on that list because of either trial and error, when you post about certain individuals or certain organizations, your content is continuously flagged and removed, or because we know who is on the State Department's list, for example, including Hamas, Islamic Jihad, the Popular Front. So the well-known Palestinian thinker and novelist Ghassan Kanafani, who is a literature figure in Palestine and to the Arab world, if you have a post praising that individual, your content is taken down because he's considered to be a dangerous individual. There is no transparency in a recent, and that list is not public. And in a recent decision by the Oversight Board, there was a demand to make that list public, because you as a speaker or as a user, if you don't know who is being banned from using that platform, how are you able to conduct yourself accordingly? And that has ramifications, by the way, on Palestinian journalists and press at large. For example, when you are, Hamas is a terrorist organization, according to the State Department and according to Facebook, and therefore no Hamas individual or someone affiliated with them can praise them or support them on the platform. Fair enough. But if you are a journalist covering Hamas, the Hamas recent parade in Gaza, that content can also be flagged and removed. And the thing here is connecting the policies with the way that Facebook enforces those policies using automation that and algorithms that are blind to all sorts of contexts, whether it be political or language context, among other issues. They are not able to make that distinction between actual praise of terrorism and journalistic content, for example. And as a result of that, we see discriminatory and arbitrary decisions and actions made by those platforms. So, I mean, to kind of summarize on the policy side, how does Facebook decide, for example, that the word resistance or the word shaheed can be a glorification of violence and terrorism? How have they designed those policies? And the short answer is they've designed them in isolation from human rights groups and from the local communities that use those words. So that's one issue. And then when we talk about the implementation and the enforcement, we see often over enforcement of those policies related to extremist content or hate speech and so on and so forth. On the one hand, I think there is, I think those companies would rather over comply with US laws and not being held liable, especially on extremist content, and overreach, overcorrect, than being held liable or fearing that they might be facing legal consequences if they kept that content on their platform. So they do sacrifice, and I would say, throw their users under the bus in order to, prevent themselves from being held liable in the US. That's one issue. And then again, the use of automation to scrutinize certain words. There's no way that you can get that right. You can't get moderation at scale right when you're scrutinizing words using tools that don't understand context and nuance. And how, we still don't know when and how and where those automations are being used. And unfortunately, the users often are not told why their content is being taken down or why their accounts are being suspended. There is no transparency about the actions. And in many of the cases we've seen, a lot of that content is being flagged as false positive, meaning that they haven't actually violated the community standards, but the users themselves don't have access to remedy. They can't appeal those decisions. So they rely on digital rights organizations like Access Now and others in order to escalate those cases to the platform. So the system in a way is broken because you as a user, on the one hand, you're not able to inform the policies that govern your own speech. And at the same time, you're unable to appeal and understand what exactly went wrong when you're being affected and when there's an action being taken against you or against your content. And as Ignacio mentioned, to add fuel to fire, that ecosystem is not as simple as user and the platform. But in the context of Israel-Palestine, the Israeli government, through the cyber unit, have been submitting since 2015 thousands upon thousands of voluntary requests to social media companies for them to take action, remove content based on their own community standards. One question here, obviously, is that how those requests use and how are they used to fold or to form or to mold the content moderation policies themselves? Are they, for example, used to train the algorithms? We don't know. And those requests don't make it really to any of the transparency reporting that we see Facebook publishes every now and then. So that there's like a black box when it comes to a government pressure and not the voluntary, non-legal requests that whether Facebook admits it or not, obviously they keep saying that they're being neutral, that their terms of services are applied equally, and evidence speaks differently to that. The terms of services are not universal. The terms of services are not applied equally to all of their users. The examples are plenty to demonstrate the opposite. But the lack of transparency on the way they develop, enforce, and respond to government requests is problematic, and there is no transparency. And I think they could do better, and they have failed on that front quite miserably.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think it raises the larger question of automation of some of these policies. And there were some reports earlier last year that in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, that some of these systems, as employees were no longer in office, that some employees were not there to do the in-person translation and the in-person flagging of content, and relying more and more on these types of algorithms meant that they were a little bit blunter and a little bit less nuanced in their decision making. And I think this raises this larger question of how a lot of this has occurred against the backdrop of the pandemic and of most of us coming to rely much, much more on broadband and on wireless communications than we did before. And Aisha, I wonder if you have any thoughts on kind of the intersection of this pandemic and of, kind of this mass understanding of the importance of digital organizing, even as unequal access to internet has made that precarious for some people. And how do you think the pre-existing scarcities faced by Palestinians as a result of COVID-19 and alongside this kind of, over-reliance on digital communications have interacted with this kind of censorship? And how do you think this all will change as we go forward and try to build a better future after this?
Absolutely. Thank you for that question. So I think one important thing to really lay down foundationally is that for the Palestinian people living under apartheid and occupation, they're facing systematic inequalities and unequal access across every sector of life in every way, from healthcare to media to education to just basic opportunity to live a happy and safe life. So this like unequal access and censorship is just another unfortunate injustice that the Palestinian people are faced with, which is something really important to lay down and to understand because the pandemic has kind of just highlighted and maybe deepened these inequalities while bringing some new ones on. Especially in the realms of healthcare, right? And the right to keep their families safe, to have access to vaccinations. These are all things that that are like really like critical and that the Palestinian people really have to fight for, and that advocacy organizations need to stand behind them in demanding those rights and getting those rights fulfilled. So I think that that's all to say that the censorship issue really needs to be couched in all of these other intersecting and interlocking issues. That to live a happy and safe life for the Palestinian people, they need to have access to all of these things in tandem because it's all connected. And I also think that it really raises the question too of like what is the power of digital organizing and how far can it go? And Marwa kind of raised this point earlier about like not overstating the role of social media, but really thinking about like what it does and what media can do for people on the ground in the case of Palestine or any other case, right? How can social media be used as a tool to highlight injustice, to bring awareness to issues, right? While at the same time not overstating the fact that, okay, maybe social media is not going to liberate Palestine. Maybe it's not going to meet every demand that the Palestinian people need, but it is a tool. It is a tool towards our collective liberation, and it's an accountability mechanism. So that's all to say that I don't think that the onus is on the individual, right? Of learning how to interact with like these unequal terrains of like social media space and physical political space differently, but to acknowledge that these systematic inequalities are present everywhere and across every sector, and to really be critical of that as we're consuming our news, as we're uplifting other voices and thinking about the ripple impact that that's going to have on people on the ground in different contexts.
Yeah, definitely. And thank you again for putting this into context. I think it's easy to kind of focus purely on the digital realm without thinking of the fact that it's embedded in a series of other interlocking and intersecting rights. And it's really important to remember that, particularly in the context of Palestine and Palestinians. Ignacio, I want to go to you just because we have this question from the audience about the possibility of journalist associations or journalist unions to speak out about freedom of the press and censorship in the Palestinian case. And I want to kind of selfishly hijack the question a little bit, so apologies, but just to add in the question about this AP journalist, Emily Wilder, and her firing by the AP kind of in response to some of her past organizing on behalf of Palestinian rights. So what does this mean about the larger role of journalism and the field of journalism internationally to protect the right for journalists to have political affiliations, particularly when it comes to Palestine, and to what can be done in terms of thinking about how to make sure that speech and reporting is free and fair.
Yeah, and that's definitely like one of the concerns that I think like have been raised lately, because like we are not only seeing this censorship in Palestine, but also like foreign outlets or foreign journalists who are covering the Palestinian conflict are being censored as well. So we saw like just as an example, like a news website had a video interview with two Palestinian journalists removed from YouTube. I saw the video interviews. There was nothing. There was no sort of incitement. But then again, like as Marwa was mentioning and Aisha were mentioning, there were images of a Hamas parade. One of the journalists was talking about how the population in Gaza was supportive of Hamas because they saw them as standing up to Israel. So all of a sudden, at a very critical time, like we see this video removed. Then again, like it was based on community standards and YouTube eventually like restored, but we are losing time at a very critical moment when we were witnessing like airstrike in the Gaza Strip and when highlighting like the suffering of the local population, of the journalists who were covering the conflict under fire. And all of a sudden, like this part is removed. So I think like this has a lot of implications internationally, since we don't know in many cases if this content removal, this removal of videos or content is based on a request made by a foreign government and circumventing like the local laws. So in many countries we have different protections for press freedom and freedom of expression. So how come that like this lack of transparency that Marwa was mentioning, like I think it's critical for this. So we need to know if this content is being removed because somebody requested it, and if this somebody is a government agency, like I think like we should be entitled to know this. So I think like this, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has ramifications all over, and I think like all of them like should be definitely like taken into account by social media platforms, social media companies.
Certainly. And as you've written pretty convincingly, there's also the issue of targeted harassment online, particularly for female journalists living and working in the Middle East. And this, I think, intersects with a kind of self-censorship. And really, you know, it's a hazard of work that I don't think is often as discussed in the context of social media, which has very real ramifications for people's health and well-being and should be taken quite seriously as well. So just kind of in our last 10 or so minutes here, I kind of would love you all to kind of join me in this thought exercise of thinking about if we, you know, had access to the policy making at really high levels at some of these tech companies and in some governments. If each of you was able to, if you could think of maybe 2 to 3 reforms or things to be addressed or areas for change around this issue, where do you see kind of the openings for, you know, drawing more attention to the issue of social media censorship and unequal access, and also for starting to remedy it, not just for the case of Palestine and Palestinians, which I think is sort of like the ultimate test case, but ultimately because this is, in my opinion, sort of a potential harbinger of things to come, particularly with other struggles and with other, you know, unequal media environments, particularly as more countries start to partition off national internets. Feels strange to use the plural internet, but here we are. So if each of you could sort of choose to make, you know, your dream policy fixes, what do you think those would be? And let's start with you, Marwa.
I like this question. I was thinking, if I were Mark Zuckerberg, what would I do? No, I mean, first of all, I think if I was a tech company, I would absolutely admit to myself and acknowledge that as a US-based company, I can't moderate the speech of billions of people around the world without speaking to them and understanding exactly how my policies have detrimental effects and negative impacts on their freedom of expression, especially when I make public commitments to respect and uphold human rights and to be transparent and accountable to my users. So I think like as an access now demand that we've been saying for years now, social media companies need to consult with civil society and human rights organizations as well as grassroots activists to understand and co-design content moderation policies that govern and impact the speech of that part of the world. It's very important. And then what we want at this point, and after all of that content moderation failure we've seen over the past few weeks, what we are asking for is a public audit of all the content moderation policies and actions related to Israel-Palestine. Because as I mentioned to you, like some of those policies that I just gave as an example, none of those you see on the website. None of those are listed as part of community standards. We know about them either through trial and error as users, where we can just infer what is going on when content is being taken down in a consistent and systematic manner, or through private consultations with civil society. And at this point, it's important for us to understand what exactly went wrong by looking both at the policies and also at the actions. The third point here is also, we understand and get that automation at this point may be inevitable and unavoidable, not only in the context of COVID-19, but I don't think any human force or human content moderators would be able to moderate this huge amount of billions of users using those platforms. So it is unavoidable, but at the same time, when those machines or those algorithms are taking action, I think users should know that the decision or the action being taken towards their content or their accounts is a result of content of automation, and should be able to remedy and have access to appeal in a very transparent and clear process. And there should be a specialized team that would be able to review that decision and rectify if it was done as a result of error. The ability of having a specialized human team to look into those decisions is extremely important. And the last point is overall transparency, including, ensuring that those transparency reports include those so-called voluntary requests that are not necessarily in the form of a court order or following a certain due process, because whether they admit it or not, as I said, they do have an impact on the policies and on the platform actions, and users should have the right to know whether their content is being removed as a result of government pressure or, at their request. And so, transparency is an encompassing requests for everything that those social media companies are doing in the context of Palestine.
Thank you so much for that. That's just a really comprehensive and useful overview and I think it helps to drive home that these are ultimately human policy decisions, and they can be addressed or reversed. These are systems we chose. We can choose to reconsider them. And I think hopefully that's something that we'll see going forward. And if I could get you a one-on-one meeting with Mark Zuckerberg, I certainly would. I'll work on that. Going to Ignacio, just in terms of how you think of this issue from a policy standpoint. Do you have some suggested ideas for reforms or for policy tweaks that you think would be useful in this sphere?
Yeah, I think mostly, I will echo what Marwa was saying. My main request would be transparency, in the way the algorithm is being used to remove content, how decisions are made, to implement these content removals, and transparency also in the appeal process. So I think journalists often do not know how to address these big tech companies, whom to talk to, and how to get their accounts restored, and they have to resort or to turn to civil society groups to help them out. But that means that in the meantime, these people have to are silenced and cannot post their content online. So we are losing voices in there. And the other request would be a better understanding of the context in which they're operating. As you said, we are talking about US-based companies who often do not know what's going on the ground. So there's a lot of conversation that need to take place with people on the ground, civil society groups, human rights groups. Like we have seen it in, like not only in Palestine, like we saw it in Syria, where a lot of videos documenting war crimes and crimes against humanity and are being removed because they basically violate, like, they portray violence. And of course they portray violence, but like it's for a purpose. So I think all these nuances are missing in many of these cases. So I would like to see more conversation and a better understanding of how things work outside San Francisco. So yeah, those would be my main request.
Yeah, I think those are excellent. And I agree with you that kind of broader understanding of the situation on the part of more types of people would be really useful. It's for that reason that I've long sort of fantasized about, having part of a required high school curriculum here in the US of like data privacy 101, that 16-year-olds would take or even younger before they get issued their first phone. But, I can dream. Aisha, let's go to you. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, just sort of where you think there are areas for change and tweaks in this policy area.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the first step here is to kind of do, like if I were a tech company, to do a fundamental critical self-analysis of where my interests lie, right? Do my interests lie in making money and profiting off of injustices and the destruction of people in their lives? And like, how does that align with my actions as a tech company, right? And I think this issue really can't be separated from the fact that like many of these big name tech companies that like we know and love and use every day fund or contribute to apartheid, to surveillance, to racially profiled automatized mechanisms in some way or form. So they're all embedded in this system that is capitalist in nature, that is structurally racist in nature, and that really needs to be reckoned with on a fundamental level, which I think is something that can't necessarily be reformed, but something that needs to be identified and pulled out at the root. But I think practically speaking, right, issues will inevitably arise with any kind of platform or tool. Now, I don't think that a tool can be inherently good or bad. Social media can't be inherently good or bad. It's how we use it. It's what are the nuances associated with how it is used? What are the powers behind it? How is information getting disseminated? And at the end of the day, does this tool have the potential to transform and adapt with the world as it's changing around us? Because the fact of the matter is that human beings aren't binary systems. We don't operate as technology does. We're fluid, we're adapting, we're changing, and technology needs to adapt to reflect that. And kind of echoing what Marwa and Ignacio have said, that's a question of if the transparency and accountability mechanisms are built in within our systems to really catch and identify the shortcomings, because they will inevitably be there. It's a matter of having proactive ways to deal with it.
Yeah, thank you, Aisha. That's really well said. Just in our last minute here, I wonder if any of you might just have something to mention for our audience as we continue to keep eyes on this issue, places that we can look for accurate information or ways that we can support Palestinians on the ground and sort of keep, focused on this as it goes on. So if any of you wants to plug a particular organization or a particular outlet or journalist that you think our audience should follow to be aware of this, please just go ahead in this last minute.
Maybe I'll jump in to say that we as Access Now, together with a coalition of other human rights organizations, both in the region but also global, are putting together a website where people can take action in relation to online censorship related to Palestine. So keep an eye out on that space, and I'm happy also to share it with you, Eliza, when it's ready and it's out.
That's great. Ignacio, did you have something you wanted to say as well?
Yeah, I would like Marwa knows them, like he works with them, but Hamle, definitely, like if you're interested in the topic of removal of content and how internet policies work in Palestine and how like it's been restricted, I think like they have some of the best research out there. So I would highly recommend people to go to them. And also Sata Social, they are also like doing a great job of documenting all these takedowns of account, content removal. So those would be my choices.
I agree. Aisha, any last things you want to plug? I saw that you put Freedom Future in the chat for our viewers, but anything else you want to mention?
Absolutely, yeah. So a big +1 to what the co-panelists have said. If you click on this link, there's actually an answer to that exact question about Palestinian outlets and people that you can follow to stay tuned. So it's all there in that consolidated spot. Those are my recommendations.
Great, thank you so much. Well, thank you again so much to Ignacio, Marwa, and Aisha for joining us. This has been a really enlightening conversation for me, and I hope for our viewers as well. I do just want to mention that this will be a two-part series, so our next panel will be focused a little bit more on the policy and legal implications as well, and I hope you'll join us for this. And please feel free to follow up with any questions to each of us, and thank you again for joining us, and yeah, enjoy the rest of your day wherever you are. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Eliza.
Thank you.